Her own family had put a price on her before she was out of the room. She heard it from the hallway, her brother's voice, and then the sound of coins counted onto a table. Slow and deliberate. The way a man counts money he has decided is more than adequate for the thing he is selling. 5. She stood with her back against the plank wall of her father's house in Birch Hollow, Kansas, with her coat already on and her single trunk already packed, and she did not go back into the room. She already knew the number. She had known it for 22 years, in every look her mother cut sideways, every chair pulled back so she could fit, every dress let out at the seams with the expression of someone being asked to do an unreasonable thing. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. Her family had never forgiven her for it. And now they had found a figure that settled the matter. $5. If you felt something just now, if that number landed somewhere it shouldn't have, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Because what Grace Alderman did next was not what her brother expected. And what Silas Vane said when he heard that number in front of every soul in Bitterroot Valley who had come to witness the arrangement is going to stay with you long after this story ends. Grace Alderman had been born in 1859 in a farmhouse outside Birch Hollow, Kansas, the second of 4 children and the only one who had grown up large. She had arrived in the world at 9 pounds and kept arriving. Growing into herself the way certain trees grow, not apologetically, but fully, using every inch of the ground she stood on. She had been told her entire life that this was a problem she was responsible for solving, and she had spent 22 years declining to solve it to anyone's satisfaction, which was not the same as failing. She was a fine cook, a capable seamstress, and she could keep accounts with the precision of a woman who has been handed nothing and therefore learned to make careful use of everything. She had kept her father's house for 4 years since her mother died. In the spring of 1881, he had taken a second wife, a woman from Salina with 2 daughters of her own and strong opinions about household arrangements. And the question of what was to be done with Grace had risen to the surface like something that had been held down a long time and was finally tired of the effort. Her brother Warren had found the advertisement in a Kansas City paper. A rancher in Montana, Silas Vane, Bitterroot Valley, 2,000 acres of high grass, required a housekeeper, capable woman, 1 year's arrangement, room and board and wages, to be discussed. Warren had written the letter without telling Grace. He had received the reply without telling Grace. He had negotiated the particulars without telling Grace. She had found out on a Tuesday when her stepmother informed her, with the particular brightness of a woman delivering news she has privately celebrated, that she would be leaving on Thursday. The $5 Grace had learned about from the hallway. The wagon driver, who took her north from the rail station at Spur Creek, was a man named Cobb, who had opinions he was not shy about sharing. Silas Vane, he said, adjusting something on the reins that did not appear to require adjusting, is a fair man. I want to say that before I say the rest. He glanced at her from the side. She was looking at the road. Lost his wife 3 winters past. Agnes was her name. Fever took her in January. He's had the boy alone since, Samuel, 10 years old. Quiet as a stone. Don't let that trouble you. Another adjustment of the reins. He's had 2 housekeepers before. First one left after a fortnight. Second one lasted 6 weeks. I drove both back to the station. He paused. I told him the arrangement was the problem, not the women. He don't listen to me on that. What was wrong with the arrangement? Grace asked. Man lives inside himself, Cobb said. Gives orders, pays wages, does exactly what he said he'd do and nothing else. Some women want a word now and then. He shrugged. might suit some better than others. It will suit me fine, Grace said. Cobb looked at her sideways. Something in his expression shifted into a shape closer to respect than he had started with. The town of Settlers Bend sat at the head of the Bitterroot Valley, like a period at the end of a long, cold sentence. Grace arrived on the freight wagon at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the main street was occupied enough that the arrival was noticed. She climbed down from the wagon without assistance. She had learned not to wait for assistance she was unlikely to receive, and lifted her trunk herself. A man outside the dry goods store stopped talking mid-sentence. A woman on the opposite boardwalk said something to her companion, who looked and then quickly looked away. Grace picked up her trunk and walked toward the post office, where Cobb had told her to wait. She had learned a long time ago that the looking never stopped. What you could control was what it cost you. She had decided some years back that it would not cost her anything she needed. And she had kept that decision in the same place she kept everything that mattered. Out of plain sight, attended to, never surrendered. She did not stop walking. Silas Vane came for her at 3 o'clock in a wagon that had seen better decades. And he was not what she expected from a man described as closed off and difficult. He was perhaps 35, with a weathered stillness about him and eyes that moved over a situation the way a surveyor's instrument moves. Measuring, neutral, looking for what is true rather than what is comfortable. He looked at her trunk, then at her, then at Cobb, who had waited. Cobb said, "Mr. Vane, this here is your new housekeeper." Silas said, "I know who she is." He said it to Cobb without looking away from the middle distance, and then he said to Grace, "I'll take the trunk." She let him take it. They drove the 11 miles to the ranch without conversation, which suited her. The road ran along the edge of a ridge with the valley falling away to the west, and the mountains to the east had already taken their first snow and were keeping it. The ranch came into view at dusk, a substantial house, a good barn, 3 outbuildings. And what struck her first was not the disrepair, but the quality of the bones underneath it. Everything that needed fixing had the look of something that had been excellent once. The fences sagged, but they were cedar, put in by someone who had intended permanence. The house needed paint, but it was square and solid and faced south to catch the winter light. It was the property of a man who had built for a future he was no longer certain he believed in. She thought of Agnes, who had died in January. The kitchen was a disaster of competent neglect. Not filthy, Silas Vane was too organized for filth, but stripped of everything that made a kitchen rather than a place where food was produced under protest. No herbs hung from the rafters, no cloth on the table. The stove was clean but cold, the fire banked low, and the air in the room had the particular flatness of a space where no one lingered. A pot on the shelf contained the remains of what had been, at some point that week, a serviceable stew. The plates were stacked with precision. The cups were in a row. Everything was in its place, and nothing was alive. Grace set her coat on the peg behind the door and put on her apron. A boy appeared in the kitchen doorway at exactly the moment she turned toward the cold stove. 10 years old, with his father's careful eyes and something else in his face, a watching quality, a held-back quality, the look of a child who has learned that most things are not safe to want. He looked at her without speaking, Grace said, "You must be Samuel." He didn't answer. He looked at the apron. "Your father said there'd be supper," Grace said. "What do you want?" He blinked. The question appeared to surprise him in a way she did not expect, as though being consulted was itself unusual. He thought about it seriously. Then he said, "Biscuits. Biscuits it is." She worked the stove back to heat and found flour and lard and a crock of salt and a jug of buttermilk on the cold shelf. And she made biscuits with the ease of a woman who has made them so many times that the hands know before the mind does. The smell filled the kitchen within the first 10 minutes. Yeast and butter and the particular warmth that only a working stove produces. The smell of a room deciding to be inhabited again. Samuel sat at the table and watched without being asked to leave. She did not ask him to leave. When Silas came in from the barn, she had biscuits and the revived stew and a pot of coffee on the table, and she was cutting the biscuits open without looking up. She heard him stop in the doorway. She did not register it. He sat. Samuel sat. She poured coffee for Silas without asking and set the pot back and sat at the far end of the table with her own plate. Silas ate without comment, but she had been watching people eat for 22 years, and she could read it plainly. The biscuit taken, the pause before the second bite, the particular quality of attention a man gives to food that has arrived in a form he did not expect. He did not ask for more. He ate 3 biscuits without speaking, and when he was finished, he set his fork down and looked at the table, in the way a man looks at a table when the thing affecting him is not the table. Samuel had gotten to his 4th biscuit when he looked up at Grace and said, with the solemn delivery of a child stating something he has decided is important, "These are better than what Pa makes." "Samuel," Silas said. "It's a fact," Samuel said. Grace did not smile, because that would have been too much. But she looked down at her plate for a moment longer than necessary. She had been at Bitterroot Valley for 11 days when she found the object that rearranged her understanding of everything. She was cleaning the front room, a room Silas used only in the evenings, for accounts, and which she had been given permission to dust but not to rearrange. And she found, on the lowest shelf behind the ledger books, a small Bible. Black cover, worn soft at the corners, the spine repaired once with careful stitching. She opened it without thinking. The reflex of a woman raised in a house where Bibles were handled freely. And on the first page inside the cover, in handwriting she did not recognize, someone had written a list. She read it slowly. It was a list of things Agnes Vane had meant to do in the spring of 1879. Plant the kitchen garden with sweet peas along the south fence. Teach Samuel to read music. Write to her mother in Ohio. Get the spare room painted before November. Below the list, in different ink and a different hand, steadier, more deliberate, were 4 words. She finished everything but these. Grace stood for a long time with the Bible open in her hands. She looked at the 4 words until she understood that they were not a note to himself and not a memorial. They were a conversation with the person who wrote the list, a man who had kept talking to his dead wife for 3 years through the margins of her Bible, because there was nowhere else to put it. She closed the Bible. She set it back exactly where she had found it. She went to the kitchen and stood at the window above the basin and looked at the fence line until the particular feeling in her chest had done what it needed to do and passed. She had been the property of people who did not value her for long enough that tenderness in unexpected places had become dangerous. She could not afford it. But she thought about Agnes, who had wanted sweet peas. She put them in on a Saturday, the last warm Saturday before the first freeze, working the near frozen ground along the south fence from sunup until the light failed, planting the bulbs she had ordered through the mercantile with wages she had not yet fully earned. She said nothing to Silas about it. He came out from the barn at dusk and stood at the fence line looking at the turned earth. And she was walking back to the house with the empty seed bag in her hand and her boots caked in frozen mud. And they passed each other at the gate in a silence that had a different quality than ordinary silence. He did not say anything that evening. Neither did she. Samuel looked from one of them to the other at supper and determined, correctly, that something had shifted, and ate his stew with the air of a child taking careful notes. 3 days later, Silas came to the kitchen in the early morning before Grace was fully up and built the fire himself without being asked. He had not done it before. He did not explain it. He left before she came downstairs. She stood at the warm stove and looked at the living fire and understood, because she had been reading people her whole life out of sheer necessity, exactly what it was. She was 3 weeks into the arrangement when Warren arrived. She heard the wagon before she saw it, that particular impatient pace, as though the road owed him time back. She stood at the kitchen window and watched it come up the drive and thought, with the calm of someone who has had a long time to arrive at a truth, that this was always going to happen. Warren would not have left the $5 alone. It was not enough that she was gone. He needed the transaction acknowledged. Silas was in the yard when the wagon pulled in. She watched Warren climb down with the proprietary ease of a man who has come to collect on something. She could not hear the words, but she knew the posture, the slight forward lean, the gesture toward the house. She watched Silas listen. He listened without moving. Then he said something. Warren's posture changed. Silas said something else. Warren looked toward the house, and Grace stepped back from the window without thinking, the old reflex of a woman who has spent her life making herself small when her family looked for something to handle. She pressed her back against the wall and stood still. $5. That was the number, counted onto a table while she stood in the hallway with her coat on. She was allowed this one moment. She used it. Then she straightened, went to the stove, and put the kettle on. Silas came inside alone. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment in the way he rarely looked directly at anything, squarely, without deflection, without. He said, "Your brother wanted the wages back." Grace said, "I gathered that." He said the agency had taken more than agreed, that the difference was owed to your family. His voice was the same flat register it always was. But there was something underneath it she had learned to hear, the particular quality of controlled anger in a careful man. He mentioned a figure. A silence. 8 seconds. "I told him I pay what a person is worth," Silas said, and I hadn't seen anything yet that suggested he had any part in determining that number. Grace turned from the stove. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall to the right of her, which was as close as he came to looking at the ground when he needed to not be watched. He said, "He won't be back?" He said it the way he said most things, as a fact, not a promise, the way fair men report the outcomes of things rather than pledging them. She said, "What did you tell him?" "I told him what I paid. He objected to the amount." A pause. "I told him it was still not enough." The kettle began to sound. Grace turned back to it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. It was who she was now. And she poured and brought him a cup and sat across from him. Neither of them spoke. The fire in the stove was sufficient, and the room smelled of the onion soup she had put on at noon. And outside, the first real snow of the season had come down on the Bitterroot Valley. Samuel came in from wherever he had been. She suspected he had watched the exchange from the barn, and stood in the kitchen doorway still wearing his coat, and looked at the two of them at the table with the expression of a person arriving at a conclusion. He said, "Is she staying?" Silas looked at Grace. Grace looked at Samuel. She said, "Yes." Samuel took off his coat and hung it on the peg beside hers. He sat at the table and picked up the bread she had left there for him and ate it without further ceremony, as though the matter had been settled to his satisfaction and there was nothing more required. which, Grace thought, was exactly right. The trouble Warren had promised on his way out arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a letter from the agency, claiming breach of the original arrangement and threatening a complaint with the County Employment Board, a public hearing, requiring Grace to appear in Settlers Bend to answer for having entered a private labor agreement outside the terms of the original placement. Warren, who was nothing if not thorough, had found the one legal mechanism available to him. What he had miscalculated was that it required Grace to appear in public. The hearing was on a Thursday in the first week of December, in the town hall of Settlers Bend, which doubled as the schoolhouse, and in winter, the gathering place for anything requiring witnesses. It was full. Cobb was there. The man from the dry goods store was there. So were the women who had watched Grace step down from the wagon 6 weeks ago, watching her now with the particular attention of people who have revised their first impression and are not yet finished revising. Warren stood at the front with a man from the agency, a small, tight-faced man from Kansas City who had the energy of someone being paid by the outcome rather than the hour. He made his argument neatly. The placement had been irregular. The wages were above the contracted rate. The arrangement had been modified without agency approval, and the original placement fee, $5 paid by the Alderman family, had been effectively stolen by an unauthorized renegotiation. $5. He said it in front of everyone. He said it the way Warren had intended it to sound, like a sum that represented what had been paid for something modest, and what had been improperly elevated above its station. The room was quiet in the particular way of people choosing to let something land. Silas Vane stood up. He was not a man who spoke in public as a matter of course, and the room felt this, felt the weight of a man choosing words he had never intended to use in front of other people. He said, "I'd like to answer the figure." The agency man said, "This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Vane. I'm aware of what it is." He looked at the agency man without blinking. Then he looked at Warren. Then he looked at the room. He said, "The $5 that was paid for this woman is the most complete misrepresentation of value I have encountered in 15 years of running a cattle operation in this valley." He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without rush. "She has kept my house, cured a lame horse that 2 men said was finished, kept accounts that found $40 of error in 6 weeks, and got my son to eat something other than dried beef for the first time since his mother died." A pause. $5 is an insult, not to the arrangement, to the woman. Warren said, "That is not the point of this proceeding." "It is the only point," Silas said. He looked at Warren with a quality of attention that was not hostility, but was its close neighbor. "You priced your sister at $5 to be rid of her. You came to my ranch to collect a debt you invented so you could collect the difference. And you used the words of a legal complaint to make her stand in this room and hear that number again." He stopped. The silence in the town hall was the silence of 150 people, deciding which way to breathe. "I'll say publicly what I told you in my yard. I pay what a person is worth. If you have a complaint about the amount, you are welcome to argue the figure, but you will not argue it against her." Cobb, from the 3rd row, said, "Here, here," with the quiet conviction of a man who had been waiting for someone to say a thing out loud. Warren left. The agency man, whose fee was apparently not high enough to cover this particular proceeding, left with him. The complaint was withdrawn for lack of a complainant willing to stand before the county magistrate, who was also in the room, in the 4th row, and had heard everything. Silas did not look at Grace as he sat back down. She did not look at him. She looked at the front of the room where Warren had been standing, and she felt the $5 go out of her. Not the hurt of it. That was older and would take longer. But the hold of it. The number that had been set on her before she was out of the room, that she had carried from Birch Hollow to Bitterroot Valley, she felt it go. And the place it had occupied was not empty. It was full of something quieter and heavier and entirely her own. That evening, the snow came back, and it meant business. By the time they reached the ranch, the drifts were coming in at an angle off the ridge, and Silas put the horses up himself while Grace got the fire going, and Samuel, who had ridden back with them in the wagon and had not said a single word the entire 11 miles, came in and took off his boots and sat at the kitchen table and said, to no one in particular, "Pa doesn't talk like that usually." "No," Grace said. "He talked like that for Ma sometimes," Samuel said. He looked at his hands on the table. When somebody said something that wasn't right. Grace set a bowl of soup in front of him. The smell of it, onion and potato, and the dried thyme she had hung in bundles from the kitchen rafters 2 weeks ago, filling the room with it the way a room deserves to be filled, rose between them like a thing that had been waiting to be released. She sat across from him and ate her own supper. And outside the snow came down on the Bitterroot Valley, and inside the fire was sufficient, and the thyme hung from the rafters, and the kitchen was a room where someone lived. In the spring, when the ground thawed, the sweet peas came up along the south fence, 10, then 20, then a full running line of them by June, climbing the cedar rails in the unhurried way of things that know exactly where they are going. Samuel found them first and brought one inside, a purple one, and set it in a cup of water on the table without a word. Silas saw it when he came in for supper, and he looked at it for a long time, and then he sat down. Grace had her back to the room. She had learned to give him the space he needed to have a feeling without an audience. She kept her back to him until she heard the chair settle with the particular sound of a man sitting down to stay. 16 years later, their daughter, Agnes Grace Vane, born in the summer of 1883, named for a woman Grace had never met but had come to know through a Bible and a list of unfinished things, was married under the sweet pea fence in the full flower of July. And Grace stood beside Silas in the grass of the yard they had kept together and watched the whole valley come to witness it. She did not need anyone's accounting of her worth. She never had. The number her family had put on her was the last time she had allowed someone else to set the price, and it had been wrong, and now it was gone, and the life she stood in had been built on the correct figure all along. She was worth exactly this, every inch of it, every year.